There is a voice inside millions of people across America, a quiet voice that never yells because it doesn't need to. It speaks in the moments when you should feel proud, when you finally get the promotion you fought for, when someone praises your work, when life gives you a win you've chased for years. Instead of letting you celebrate, this voice leans in and whispers the same sentence every time. You don't deserve this. It tells you someone made a mistake choosing you, that sooner or later people will realize you are not who they think you are. And the cruel part is that the more you achieve, the louder this voice becomes. It's the inner saboteur that countless Americans face today, and it quietly shapes careers, relationships, and even identities from the inside out. According to Epictetus, we suffer more in imagination than in reality. That whisper of inadequacy isn't a reflection of truth. It's a distortion, a mental funhouse mirror that bends every victory into suspicion and every accomplishment into doubt. In a culture obsessed with performance, productivity, and being exceptional, many grow up believing they're standing on a stage waiting to be exposed. The fear isn't just failing, the fear is being seen failing. And so the mind turns against itself, not because you're weak, but because you were trained to believe you must always be more than human. This is the invisible weight so many Americans carry into work, relationships, and personal goals every day. According to Marcus Aurelius, reject your sense of injury and the injury itself disappears. This is where Stoicism steps into the room. Not as ancient poetry for old philosophers, but as a modern antidote to a modern crisis. Because what we call impostor syndrome today, the Stoics recognized thousands of years ago as a false judgment. A story the mind invents, not a truth about who you are. They understood something that psychology keeps rediscovering. The mind can imprison you or it can free you. And the difference between prison and freedom begins with the stories you believe about yourself. According to Seneca, most powerful is he who has himself in his own power. So before we move deeper, take a breath. You are not the only one who feels this way. CEOs, artists, soldiers, parents, entrepreneurs, and students across America feel it too. Not because they are frauds, but because they care so deeply about what they do, and caring creates fear. The Stoics believed this fear is not your enemy, but your teacher. It isn't trying to expose you, it's trying to wake you up. This is the Stoic Lighthouse. Let the Stoic Lighthouse guide you toward clarity and inner steadiness. If this message is already hitting something inside you, support the channel with a like and subscribe so this philosophy can reach more people who need it. Today, you'll uncover why the imposter inside you doesn't want to destroy you. It wants to be understood, and once you understand it, you'll never be controlled by it again. Number 1, the mind that turns against you. There is a moment in every person's life, especially in a culture like the United States that idolizes achievement, where the mind stops being an ally and becomes an interrogator. It questions your victories, rewrites your past, and casts suspicion over your future. You look at your accomplishments yet feel disconnected from them, almost as if they happened to someone else. This mental split is the birthplace of imposter syndrome. The Stoics would call it a false perception. Modern psychology would call it cognitive distortion. But to anyone who feels it, the experience is far more personal. It is the unsettling feeling that the person others see is not the one you feel you are. Inside this fracture, self-doubt grows like a shadow, spreading even faster when things go well. According to Heraclitus, you could not step into the same river twice because both you and the river have changed. Heraclitus understood that identity is fluid. You are constantly evolving, growing, becoming someone new. Yet imposter syndrome freezes your self-image in time, convincing you that you are the same person you once were, even when everything in you has changed. It traps you in outdated narratives. Maybe you once felt insecure, unprepared, or inexperienced, but the mind grabs those old versions of you and drags them into the present as if they still define you. This is the great illusion, believing that your past identities invalidate your present growth. In truth, the discomfort you feel isn't proof of fraud, it is proof of transformation, the natural friction that occurs when you step into a chapter you earned but have not yet emotionally inhabited. According to Socrates, I know that I know nothing. Socrates understood the paradox at the heart of all wisdom. The more you grow, the more aware you become of how much you still don't know. Impostor syndrome twists this humility into guilt. What should be a sign of maturity becomes mistaken for incompetence. But awareness of limitation is not evidence of inadequacy. It is evidence of your capacity to learn, adapt, and expand. In the American workforce, where expertise is often mistaken for perfection, this misunderstanding fuels constant self-surveillance. People fear that admitting uncertainty will expose them. Yet the greatest thinkers, innovators, and leaders throughout history embraced uncertainty as the beginning of mastery. According to Musonius Rufus, it is not enough to know what is right. One must practice it. This is where Stoicism begins to dissolve the illusion. The impostor latches onto thoughts. The Stoic focuses on actions. When you replace self-judgment with practice, a subtle shift occurs. The voice that once accused you becomes quieter because your attention is no longer on the story it tells, but on the work you are doing. Americans often grow up inside a perfectionist culture, one that rewards appearance over substance. But practice is the great unmasker. It reveals what the mind tries to hide, that you are more capable than you believe, more prepared than you assume, and more resilient than your doubts want you to see. According to Epictetus, you become what you give your attention to. A mind consumed by fear creates a self-image built on fear, but a mind disciplined toward growth begins to rewrite the narrative from the inside. Impostor syndrome thrives in stillness, it suffocates in movement. Every action you take that aligns with your values weakens the grip of that internal critic. The more you step forward, the more your mind is forced to update the outdated stories it tells about you. This is how the illusion breaks, not through reassurance, but through lived evidence that contradicts the fear. The mind that turns against you is the same mind that can set you free. The inner critic is not an enemy to be destroyed, but a confused guardian to be retrained. As the Stoics understood, the story you believe about yourself becomes the life you experience. When you begin rewriting that story with clarity, discipline, and truth, the impostor loses its power. Number 2, the fear of being seen too clearly. In every corner of modern American life, people live under a silent pressure to perform. At work, at school, online, even within families, there is the constant sense of being evaluated. Not for who you are, but for how well you appear to be holding everything together. This constant performance turns the eyes of others into a kind of invisible spotlight. And for someone struggling with imposter syndrome, that spotlight becomes blinding. It creates the fear that if people look too closely, they will discover every flaw, every insecurity, every unfinished part of your character. The greatest fear is not failure itself, but the possibility of being witnessed in the act of failing. In a culture built around visibility and social comparison, being truly seen can feel like a threat instead of a connection. According to Cleanthes, the wise remain steady when others bend to appearances. Cleanthes knew that the judgment of others has no real weight unless you give it to them. But in today's world, appearance has more power than ever. Likes, metrics, promotions, opinions, reputations, image. Everything is measured. And when everything is measured, everything is feared. The mind begins to assume that every look is an evaluation, every silence a disapproval, every interaction a test. Imposter syndrome feeds on this fear. It convinces you that everyone else possesses a clarity about your flaws that you yourself cannot deny. It makes the outer world feel like a courtroom, and you, the defendant, always one mistake away from being exposed. According to Chrysippus, good and bad do not lie in the voices around us, but in how we choose to respond to them. Chrysippus understood the crucial separation between external noise and internal judgment. The opinions of others are events, not truths. Yet when you are anxious, the mind fuses them together. It treats random expressions, neutral interactions, or even imagined criticisms as evidence that you are not enough. But the Stoics taught that no one else's perception has the authority to define your worth. Your response to those perceptions does, and this is where modern individuals often hand over their power. They let strangers, co-workers, social media, and distant expectations dictate how they feel about themselves. According to Michel de Montaigne, there is no shame in admitting what we do not know. The shame lies in pretending we know. Montaigne's insight cuts through a deeply American fear, the fear of not appearing competent. In a culture that reveres confidence, people often perform certainty even when they don't feel it. They hide questions, they hide confusion, they hide vulnerability, and this hiding creates the illusion that everyone else is more prepared, more knowledgeable, more secure. Impostor syndrome thrives in this illusion. It convinces you that you are the only one struggling, the only one doubting, the only one afraid. But the truth is simpler. Everyone is afraid of being seen too clearly. Everyone carries parts of themselves they aren't sure how to reveal. According to Schopenhauer, what others think of us shifts like the wind. No shelter should be built on it. Schopenhauer's clarity exposes the fragility of external validation. Yet many build their sense of worth on exactly that. They monitor the shifting winds of approval, hoping to construct a stable identity out of unstable materials. Imposter syndrome becomes inevitable under these conditions because the foundation itself is unstable. When the self is built on the gaze of others, the self will always feel threatened. But when the self is built on inner principles, the gaze of others loses its power. The fear of being seen too clearly is not a sign that something is wrong with you. It is a sign that you have relied on the wrong sources to define yourself. You do not need to hide. You do not need to perform. You do not need to fear the eyes of others. The Stoics invite you to shift the center of your identity from external judgment to internal truth. And once that shift happens, something extraordinary occurs. Being seen no longer feels like a threat. It begins to feel like freedom. Number 3, the quiet strength of real humility. In the American mindset, humility is often misunderstood. Many see it as weakness or self-erasure, as if being humble means lowering yourself so others can rise. Yet the Stoics saw humility not as a collapse, but as a calibration. It is the ability to see yourself clearly without shrinking and without inflating. And in a culture that celebrates confidence, hustle, achievement, and constant self-promotion, humility becomes a rare kind of power. Not the loud kind, the steady kind, the kind that cannot be shaken by praise or destroyed by criticism. It is this quiet strength that dismantles imposter syndrome at its roots. Because the imposter is obsessed with appearing worthy, while the humble person is focused only on being truthful. According to Diogenes of Sinope, to need less is to approach freedom. Diogenes used simplicity to demonstrate a profound truth. The less you depend on the approval of others, the more powerful you become. Modern Americans grow up surrounded by the idea that worth is earned through achievement, possessions, and public validation. But this creates a dangerous pattern. When your identity comes from performance, any moment of insecurity feels like collapse. Diogenes, in his raw honesty, reminds us that freedom begins where dependency ends. The imposter inside you depends heavily on perception. Humility breaks this dependency. It allows you to exist without pretending, without performing, without proving anything to anyone. According to Chrysippus, the ignorant believe they have already grasped wisdom. The wise know it can never be fully reached. Chrysippus exposes the trap of perfectionism. Impostor syndrome thrives on the belief that you must be complete before you can be worthy. But the wise understand that incompletion is the natural condition of every human life. There is no arrival, no final version, no flawless self. Humility accepts this truth without resistance. It acknowledges your strengths without exaggeration and your limitations without shame. This balance feels foreign in the American environment, where people are encouraged to sell themselves, market their strengths, and curate their identity. But this curation often becomes camouflage for fear. Humility removes the camouflage. It lets you stand as you are, unfinished but sincere. According to Michel de Montaigne, there is no disgrace in confessing what we do not know. Montaigne's voice bridges the old world with the new. His insight resonates deeply in a society where productivity culture pressures everyone to seem endlessly competent. Admitting uncertainty in America can feel like admitting defeat, but this fear is precisely what fuels imposter syndrome. Humility reframes the experience. It turns "I don't know" into an act of wisdom rather than weakness. It transforms vulnerability into clarity, and it opens a door that appearances keep shut, the possibility of learning, growing, and evolving without fear of judgment. According to Brené Brown, vulnerability is not weakness. It is our most accurate measure of courage. This is the modern voice the Stoics would welcome. Brené Brown's work on vulnerability mirrors the Stoic idea that courage is not the absence of fear, but the decision to face it openly. When you allow yourself to be seen as imperfect, something unexpected happens. The imposter loses oxygen. Vulnerability removes the illusion that you must be flawless to be worthy. American culture often pushes people to project strength at all times, yet the deepest strength is found in authenticity. Vulnerability becomes a path back to inner solidity when the outer world feels unstable. According to William B. Irvine, the mind finds peace when it stops chasing validation and starts cultivating inner excellence. Irvine's modern interpretation of Stoicism explains why imposter syndrome feels so exhausting. When your worth depends on external approval, you must constantly monitor, impress, and outperform. But when your worth comes from inner excellence, performance becomes irrelevant. You act well because it is aligned with your character, not because someone is watching. This internal orientation is humility in action. It redirects your energy away from self-presentation and towards self-development. According to Angela Duckworth, grit grows when effort matters more than perfection. Duckworth's research aligns perfectly with Stoic discipline. The imposter wants immediate certainty. The humble person embraces long-term effort. They understand that character is built through persistence, not polish. In American culture, where overnight success stories dominate headlines, this reminder is vital. Real progress is slow, steady, imperfect, and deeply human. Humility embraces that truth instead of resisting it. According to James Clear, you do not rise to the level of your goals, you fall to the level of your systems. James Clear bridges ancient philosophy and modern behavioral psychology. Systems are habits, habits are identity, and identity is shaped through repeated action, not performance. Imposter syndrome collapses under the weight of consistent practice because practice proves what fear denies. Humility supports this practice. It keeps you grounded, disciplined, and honest with yourself, even when the mind tries to resurrect old doubts. Real humility is not thinking less of yourself. It is thinking truthfully about yourself. It dissolves the illusion of being superior and the illusion of being inferior. It allows you to move through the world without comparing, competing, or pretending. And once humility becomes your foundation, the imposter inside you has nowhere left to stand. Number 4. what you can control, and why it changes everything. There's a particular kind of anxiety that quietly shapes American life. It's the pressure to manage outcomes, reputations, impressions, opportunities, and every unpredictable detail of the future. People try to control how they are perceived at work, how their relationships unfold, how their careers evolve, how their image appears online, even how others interpret their silence. This relentless attempt to control what cannot be controlled fuels imposter syndrome more than anything else. Because when you feel responsible for what lies outside your reach, every uncertainty becomes a threat. Every outcome becomes a judgment. Every reaction becomes a verdict. And this is where the Stoics draw a sharp line that modern psychology continues to rediscover. According to Panaitios of Rhodes, the wise do not try to change fate, they learn how to walk with it. Panaitios captured the heart of the Stoic mindset. Not a passive surrender to life, but a strategic understanding of what is and isn't within your grasp. Most of the emotional suffering people face today comes from trying to control external events, the job market, the opinions of others, the unpredictable shifts of the economy, the outcomes of bold decisions, but none of these things truly belong to you. They exist in the outer world, governed by forces larger than your will. The more you chase control over them, the more powerless you feel. And when powerlessness combines with high expectations, imposter syndrome takes root. According to Posidonius, the wise do not fight the tides of the mind. They learn how to navigate them. Posidonius understood something that echoes through modern neuroscience. You cannot control your emotions directly. You cannot stop fear from arising, or anxiety from tightening your chest, or doubt from whispering in the quiet moments. But you can control your response. You can choose your actions, your interpretations, your direction. In American culture, people are often encouraged to fix their feelings, to force certainty, to eliminate doubt. Yet the Stoic approach is different. It teaches you to surf the emotional waves instead of trying to calm the entire ocean. This shift frees you from the exhausting attempt to manage everything and brings your focus back to the only place where strength truly resides: your choices. According to William B. Irvine, peace comes when we stop demanding that the world behave the way we wish. Irvine's modern reframe captures the essence of Stoic resilience. Imposter syndrome grows when you believe the world must give you a predictable reaction each time you act. Appreciation, approval, validation, security, but the world is unpredictable. People are inconsistent, outcomes are uncertain. When your sense of worth depends on these external responses, you become trapped in a constant state of performance anxiety. Irvine invites you to shift your expectations inward, to measure success not by applause, but by integrity, not by results, but by the quality of your effort. When you adopt this view, the chaos outside loses power over you. According to Massimo Pigliucci, tranquility grows when we invest in the process instead of obsessing over results. Pigliucci's insight speaks directly to the American struggle for certainty. People want guarantees. They want assurance that if they work hard enough, they will succeed. But life does not operate on guarantees. It operates on probabilities, timing, and complexity. When imposter syndrome convinces you that your value depends on outcomes, uncertainty becomes unbearable. But when your value is grounded in the process itself, uncertainty becomes manageable, even meaningful, because the process is something you can control. According to James Clear, your choices are the steering wheel of your identity. Clear's work bridges ancient Stoic discipline with modern behavioral science. You cannot control how people see you, but you can control how you show up. You cannot control whether success comes quickly or slowly, but you can control whether you keep moving. You cannot control the future, but you can control the systems that shape it: your habits, your attitude, your consistency, your courage. Every small choice you make is an act of reclaiming power from the external world and placing it back where it belongs, in your hands. According to Marcus Aurelius, you have power over your mind, not outside events. Realize this, and you will find strength. Now, this is the core of the Stoic cure. When your identity is built on what you can control, the imposter inside you loses authority. It wants you to obsess about outcomes because outcomes are uncertain. It wants you to chase approval because approval is unstable. But when you return your attention to what is yours: effort, honesty, discipline, intention, you become grounded, solid, unshakable. The world can shift around you, but you no longer collapse with it. The dichotomy of control does not eliminate fear. It eliminates the confusion that makes fear overwhelming. Once you understand what belongs to you and what does not, the mind becomes quieter, the heart becomes steadier, and the imposter inside you begins to fade, not because you silenced it, but because you stopped believing it was speaking the truth. Number 5. The courage to act even when you don't feel ready. There is a moment familiar to countless Americans. The moment right before you take action. You hesitate, you replay every flaw, you imagine every failure. You feel the weight of expectations pressing against your ribs. And then the voice appears. The same voice that has followed you for years, the one that whispers you are not prepared enough, skilled enough, experienced enough. It convinces you that you must feel confident before you move. But the Stoics, and every modern thinker who truly understands human behavior, agree on one thing. Confidence is not the beginning of action. Action is the beginning of confidence. Waiting to feel ready is how the imposter inside you keeps you frozen in place. According to Lucian of Samosata, the one who speaks of virtue but never acts is like a musician who never touches his instrument. This simple truth exposes the trap of modern perfectionism. In a culture where achievement is constantly displayed, compared and measured, many Americans fall into the belief that expertise must come first and action second. But expertise is the child of repetition. Growth comes from doing. The imposter's greatest weapon is paralysis, because paralysis preserves the illusion that you are not enough. The moment you act, the illusion begins to weaken. Each step you take contradicts the fear that tells you not to step at all. According to Heracles, what is not practiced decays, what is practiced grows. This understanding forms the backbone of both ancient Stoicism and modern behavioral psychology. You become what you repeatedly do. Courage is not a personality trait, it is a habit. Action is not the result of confidence. It is the forge where confidence is shaped. In American culture, people value talent, but research from modern thinkers has uncovered that talent explains far less than we once believed. The real transformation comes from steady and deliberate action, even when your emotions resist. According to Donald Robertson, fear is inevitable, but it only stops you if you obey it. Robertson's psychological interpretation of Stoicism mirrors what the ancients taught. Fear is not the enemy. Avoidance is. You cannot eliminate fear, but you can walk with it. You can move through it. You can act in its presence instead of waiting for its absence. This is what dismantles imposter syndrome from within. The moment you choose action over hesitation, you reclaim authority over your own mind. According to Angela Duckworth, grit is the power of staying in motion when motivation fades. Duckworth's research reveals something Americans desperately need to hear. Motivation is unreliable. Inspiration fluctuates. Discipline is what carries you through the days when you feel uncertain or afraid. Imposter syndrome tells you that if you were truly capable, things would feel easier. But grit reveals the opposite. The people who succeed are not the ones who felt ready. They are the ones who kept going. They built momentum through consistency, and that momentum slowly reshaped how they saw themselves. According to Brené Brown, courage begins with showing up. This simple sentence strikes at the heart of the imposter's lies. You do not need to be perfect to show up. You do not need to know everything to show up. You do not need to silence all fear before you show up. You only need to arrive, to take the first step, to allow yourself to be seen as a work in progress rather than a finished product. In a society that often equates worth with performance, showing up imperfectly becomes an act of rebellion, an act of strength. According to James Clear, small actions, repeated consistently, build an identity you begin to trust. This is where modern habit science meets ancient philosophy. The imposter inside you bases your identity on fear, but habits rebuild your identity through evidence. Each action becomes a vote for the person you want to be. The more votes you cast, the more the mind updates its story. Slowly, steadily, it begins to believe the truth. Not because you convinced it with words, but because you proved it with action. According to Marcus Aurelius, do what is right. The rest does not matter. This is the Stoic spirit at its core. Action guided by integrity, effort guided by character, movement guided by purpose. Not performance, not appearance, not validation. When you live this way, the imposter loses its influence. The fear of exposure becomes irrelevant because you are no longer performing. You are participating in your own life with honesty and courage. The courage to act without feeling ready is the ultimate antidote to imposter syndrome. Because each action becomes a declaration that you are no longer ruled by fear. You are ruled by your values, by your principles, by the person you choose to become. There comes a moment when the inner struggle quiets. Not because the doubts disappear, but because you finally see them for what they are, echoes of old fears that no longer define the person you have become. Imposter syndrome convinces you that you must keep proving yourself to the world. Stoicism teaches the opposite. You do not need to prove who you are. You need only to live in alignment with your values. The rest settles itself. When you stop performing for an imagined audience and start acting from truth, something shifts. The weight on your shoulders begins to lift. The self-criticism softens, the mind grows steadier, and you realize that the person you were always trying to earn the right to be was already there within you, waiting for permission to step forward. According to Chrysippus, virtue is not a title to be claimed, it is a habit to be lived. These words capture the essence of the journey you've taken. The imposter seeks titles, applause, certainty, and external approval. But the Stoic understands that character is formed through action, not recognition. When you commit to your own growth, your own discipline, your own integrity, you become someone who no longer relies on the judgment of others to feel real. The self becomes grounded. The inner landscape becomes clear, and the noise of insecurity begins to fade. According to Pierre Hadot, philosophy is not an escape from life, it is a way of inhabiting it completely. Hadot's insight reveals the true purpose of this path. Stoicism is not a wall you build to shield yourself, it is the foundation you stand on. It teaches you to meet the world as it is, without distortion and without fear. When you see yourself clearly, and when you understand what is within your control, you walk through life not as an imposter, but as a participant. Not as someone waiting to be exposed, but as someone ready to act. If something in this message spoke to you, leave a comment below sharing what resonated the most. Your words might be exactly what someone else needs to read today. And before you go, remember to like this video, share it with someone who is carrying silent self-doubt, and subscribe to the channel so we can continue exploring this philosophy together. Your support allows the Stoic Lighthouse to keep guiding people toward a steadier, calmer, and more courageous life. In the next video, we are diving into a truth that modern psychology is only now beginning to understand. but the ancient Stoics already knew with astonishing clarity. It is a lesson about happiness that Seneca understood centuries before science could measure it. A lesson that reveals why so many people chase fulfillment in the wrong places and why the answer has been hiding in plain sight all along. What we're going to uncover has the potential to reshape how you pursue meaning in your everyday life. This journey does not end with certainty. It begins with honesty. It begins with awareness. And it begins with the courage to let go of the masks you never needed. The wise do not pretend, they simply are. See you in the next video.